Well, Salim, there's an ancient Chinese proverb I understand that says, "May you live in interesting times." And I think we live in interesting times. I haven't heard this much chatter about China since Nixon visited there in '72. Since Trump got elected, we've had the China trade agreements. Just recently, of course, we had the coronavirus, ominously called coronavirus disease 2019 or COVID-19, almost portending a series of viruses, COVID-20, COVID-22, who knows. But with the coronavirus, we've seen a massive drop in the Dow Jones and the TSX and stock markets throughout the world as trade is being impeded with this coronavirus. Communication is being impeded via transportation. And what other things? China, you've had Justin Trudeau say that he loves China the most because they can turn things around on a dime. Well, let's see if they turn this thing around on a dime. It's beyond biology, it's beyond virology, it's come into politics now with a lot of things happening in the political field because of this black swan, I think you've recalled it, this unforeseen, unpredictable event. I think black swan is a financial term, wasn't it? Quoted many years ago by some financial stockbroker or something like that, an economist who basically said that there are things that happen which nobody can predict, which have dramatic consequences, and this is one of them. What's the political fallout from all of this coronavirus, Salim?
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about the politics of coronavirus. I mean, that's what it is. The the illness, malady, or the influenza type flu disease that people are afraid of is going pandemic is something else. That's the people who are experts in virology and medicine. They can talk about it with some authority, but we can pause and reflect on the politics because it has become politicized now. The whole issue has become politicized, both globally and also, of course, in the United States. I don't know where our position is in Canada. You mentioned black swan, or rather I had mentioned black swan and you're picking it up. I mean, people are now referring to the coronavirus as the black swan of the Chinese, and the fact that the Chinese government possibly have no clue on how to deal with this situation. That's something else we need to talk about in terms of the politics of coronavirus. But just on black swan, yes, I mean, you're right. You were thinking about the man, Nassim Taleb, a Lebanese businessman, financier, mathematician, statistician, who in his book Black Swan about a decade ago brought the term into public usage. And what he meant by the metaphor of the black swan is that something that is totally unexpected, had not been foreseen. Few people had any knowledge of it. And so it was not in the realm of any possibility. And then it happens. And when it happens, people don't know how to deal with it, you know. It comes as a shock and a surprise. And that's about what he was referring to in the context of the market's ups and downs and the 2007, 2008 crash that took place in the global market, the world economy, starting with the US economy. If you go back to 2007, 2008, you know, that was when the term came into usage. And so now it basically refers to anything that was unexpected and improbable, striking us in a manner that leaves us, again, not only confused, but searching for answers that create more problem. And that's where the politics comes in, the politics, which what we are now faced with, coronavirus. You know, I mean, we don't know fully because China is a closed society. China is a totalitarian society, you know, and we can and should talk about China, and what not only this means, but what does a closed society and information out of a closed society, what is coming out, drip, 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 means for all of us now. China hasn't given an explanation of where and how all of this began, but what we little know about it, that is through first the leakage of the news through Hong Kong and people that were traveling out of China, that is out of Hubei province, Wuhan, that has been collected together. The first patient, the first people first individual, as a matter of fact, who was identified with what has come to be termed now the coronavirus, was way back in December. And the doctor who identified it and tried to bring it to the notice, not only the Chinese government, when this matter escalated, Dr. Li Wanliang, was in a sense quarantined and imprisoned, and later he died. So the man who dealt with this at the first instant is no longer around. So anyhow, this disease sprang out in sometime in December, and then the next that we know about it is coincides with the Chinese New Year, end of January, beginning of February, when the word went round that the city of Wuhan, the capital of Hubei province, has been put in a quarantine, and reports of death started coming in. First it was few hundred, then it was 1,000 plus. It rose up, and I think now it is in several thousand. A city the size of Wuhan, which is about twice the size of Toronto and GTA, with 11 million population, bigger than the city of New York or Paris, was shut down. And then eventually the entire Hubei province was shut down with a population of over 50 million people, quarantined. And now it has spread even larger. I believe Chinese are now putting quarantines in other parts of adjacent provinces to Hubei provinces. Traffic has almost come to a standstill. The other countries are now putting, restrictions on people moving out of China and going to places outside of China. But the matter has, to some extent, already spread. We are getting news from places like Europe that Italy is the most seriously affected, or feared to be the most seriously affected. Something like a dozen towns has been put on a lockdown, including Venice and Milan. We are hearing about, sports have been stopped, the football season, soccer season, and Italy, where teams traveling between cities have been stopped. There are reports that, for instance, Saudi Arabia has put a lockdown and stopped any foreign Muslim pilgrim from outside of Saudi Arabia heading to the two holiest cities in Saudi Arabia, the two holy cities of Islam in Mecca and Medina. So that's been on a lockdown. And so there is a real serious concern how far and how rapidly this will go. But there's also, in a sense, good news that I have picked up. You might have also heard about it. I think it was late last night, early this morning news, that vaccine has been developed by the Israelis, and it is being put to test and should be coming into the market pretty soon. The Americans are really up on this matter too, and they are in the process of either getting a vaccine out or expect that it will be out, that their people will be able to figure out and get a vaccine out and get it tested and get it outside. So all of that is taking place, but let's put it in context, Robert. Let's put it in context before, what is happening is just the mainstream media, and of course the social media, the Twitter and all of these things are now in full flight. And it is a technology that not only gets the word moving fast, but can also get the panic growing and mushrooming, in a manner that we have not foreseen before. But there are some landmark events that we can reflect on. I mean, immediately in my mind comes, if you recall, Robert, the almost pandemonium before the millennial clock change, the Y2K issue, if you recall. There was a panic that the whole world will possibly collapse. Our computer shuts down, and what will happen to our individual account, personal account, data, records, everything is on the computer. And if it shuts down, and that panic was there and built up, and millions of dollars were spent on the assumption, I believe possibly billions, banks and insurance companies and others were updating their systems and running through various tests to prevent this Y2K pandemonium from taking us over. But none of that happened. Now, was that a fake news? Was that something that was artificially created for a whole new stream of investment? I think a lot of people got very rich on that issue, as they went about talking about the Y2K problem, and then, getting the funding to deal with that challenge that turned out to be a big dud. There was, a few years later, there was the SARS pandemic, if you remember, the avian flu.
And that also was a coronavirus as well, I understand. Just a different variant. Yeah.
A variation, and again, it was avian flu, jumped from the chicken to the human beings, from birds to men, and that was a panic, and it hit us in Canada, it hit us in Ontario, in 2003, 4, I think it was, if my recollection go back, and the media ran with the story, but then, as happened with all of these media-fed stories, it faded away, and now it is part of memory that we have to work hard to recall.
So what about the political end of this, Salim? Because right now we're talking about, well, the facts. You just went over the details of the facts of the coronavirus leading up to today quite well, but now we have people blaming Trump, for example. Of course, they want to call it the Trump virus, but then again, the never Trumpers and the Trump derangement syndrome people suffering from their own sort of mental virus have seize upon any opportunity they can to disparage President Trump. He can either do too much or too little. He's damned if he does, damned if he doesn't. And let's speak about the effect with Trump first, and then let's go to Trudeau after that.
Sure. I mean, let's talk about that. But because again, I was trying to put it in context. 2 days ago, Trump had a press conference in the White House, and he introduced his team, and he's appointed the Vice President Pence to head the task force to deal with this challenge that everyone is faced with. And America, being what America is, has taken the leadership in trying to deal with this immense problem. But it won't satisfy his critics. It won't satisfy his political foes, and they're out. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer called Trump a towering incompetence. Nancy Pelosi called that he doesn't know anything about science and doesn't trust it. Why haven't Trump asked for more money, and that Trump had cut back, that his Trump administration has cut back on funding of CDC, that is the
Center for Disease Control.
Center for Disease Control, and that has turned out to be a hoax. In fact, the financing and the funding of CDC under Trump administration has, as a matter of fact, increased, and it is not the administration that earmarks the budget. It is the money that has to come from the Congress, and so ultimately it is Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer that is responsible. Nancy Pelosi as Democratic controlled House to raise the fund, and if Trump had said that he needs $10 billion, they would have said, no, that's too little. He is behind. So this is the political weaponization of any issue in American politics in the Trump era. But Trump took action a month ago. I mean, it was towards the end of January, January 29, January 30, that the Trump administration announced a travel ban of people flying out of China. I mean, as the problem was just beginning to surface and people were taking note of it in Hong Kong, China had gone down into both the problem that had emerged with coronavirus, but it also was the Chinese Lunar New Year. And the Chinese were on a vacation at that time. But Trump immediately called for a halt on travel. And flights coming out of China was being directed differently by the Americans. They were, I'm told, were not being allowed to land in California. They were being sent off to designated cities where they were being prepared. The passengers coming out would be then checked out before being released. And now they are all being directed, I believe, to Omaha, Nebraska. So that was way back in January 29th. And what was the response, Robert? The response was that here is again, Trump is being, racist. This is a racist administration. They're targeting China. But here you have it. I mean, a country with 330 plus million people, and the number of cases that have been reported is somewhere in the neighborhood of 60, and there's only a handful that have been identified with coronavirus that has come out of China and who have been isolated. Whereas in Europe, this is a real problem because it's open borders, people moving around. Italy and Austria are considered the most seriously endangered or affected area.
Yeah, let's just talk about that racism epithet for a moment, Salim, because we heard it here in Canada as well, with government officials basically saying that you cannot disparage the Chinese race, I guess, rather than country, for their eating habits and their hygiene habits, or any other aspect which may or may not have led to the spread of this particular virus. And it's almost like the Islamist question. You're not allowed to talk about it. Otherwise, you're deemed a racist. Is that the issue of our day, that everything boils down to the race issue?
Precisely. I mean, this is what we are dealing with. I mean, this is the political correctness that is totally off the track. If you cannot discuss the problem, if you cannot identify the source, if you cannot understand the cultural matrix within which these things happen, then how are we going to deal with the problem? The fact of the matter is, this thing emerged in a very specific location, and then we are not getting the news in detail, in an open, honest fashion from the Chinese themselves. That is the feature of a communist society, as I said right in the opening remarks, that it is a closed society. It is not an open society. Everything is censored. China has put a lockdown. 70 million people are quarantined. I mean, the specialist tells us that quarantine is not an effective way to dealing with this problem, because then it becomes, incestuous. It is inbreeding, people are affecting themselves. So this is not the way to handle it, but that's what the Chinese have done. This is the totalitarian state, and this is how they deal with their own people. And now you have, as you're pointing out, within Canada, Liberal Party, of course, our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, has always been infatuated, as you pointed out very correctly, with the Chinese. He loved the Chinese. He's spoken about the Chinese administration as a model because, China as a dictatorship, as an authoritarian leadership, can, on a drop of a hat, make decisions, and affect the lives of millions, billions of people. But the fact that they can make decisions, this is the wonder of Mr. Justin Trudeau. And so, we have that situation. We have in the American situation, I mean, before we get into the question of supply chain and economics, fact individuals, I mean, the leading contender now among the handful who are running for the Democratic nomination is Michael Bloomberg, the third or the fourth richest man in the world. with estimated wealth that somewhere in the neighborhood of $70 billion. And much of that money, maybe 2/3 of that money, has been made in China. And he has been reported as talking about that you don't talk about this with the Chinese in the manner that President Trump has dealt with it. And he, of course, is also another person who is a great admirer of the Chinese society, of the authoritarian leadership. I mean, he has been quoted as saying, China is not a democracy, but that doesn't mean it's not a democracy like ours. The leader and the people are engaged in it. Well, Mr. Bloomberg doesn't know the way the leader and the people are engaged with it is typically, iconically, the way Deng Xiaoping and the Chinese leadership dealt with the students in that Tiananmen Square massacre of June 1989. People have forgotten that, or any number of events that I can talk about, that the Chinese leadership had dealt with the people, from Great Leap on to Cultural Revolution to the famine, the great Mao Zedong was responsible for somewhere around about between 70 and 100 million people.
When you talk about the massacres that the Communist People's Party, Communist Party in China have perpetrated on their people, there have been some videos coming out of that regime, out of that nation, which purport to show police or officials in their hazmat suits carrying firearms, going into buildings, shooting people or shooting people on the street. There's actually videos of bodies on the street, huddled together and dead, for failure to obey evacuation orders. Now, whether that's true or not, who's to know? I wouldn't put it past the communist regime, but of course it's very difficult. It's almost like trying to get the truth out of CNN. It's pretty much impossible. And there's also videos, Salim, of officials, again in hazmat suits, welding doors shut to tall apartment buildings, where that's one way to keep people contained, is to just make sure that they can't get out of their buildings. Now, whether this is true or not is again hard to say, but that's the politics of it, isn't it, in that communist regime? What do we have to, if Trudeau is actually enamored by such people, such tactics, such a government, what can we expect here in Canada if, God forbid, that it happens here that a lot of people become infected?
Well, I mean, for the globalists and those of us who have been talking about globalism, and you and I have been talking about globalism, it is for us to really take a closer and closer look at what's happening in China, because this is in a sense a laboratory of the globalists. It is the globalists that have made China the linchpin of the global economy as the center of the supply chain. And we need to talk about that. But getting back to whether what you have just pointed out is true or not, I have no doubt. I've been to China and I've traveled through the inner China. So whatever is China in many senses is a Potemkin village that the tourists, they go to when they see, whether they're visiting Beijing or Shanghai, or Canton on the coast. And of course, there has been immense, rapid developments over there. China has today its own list of billionaires and multimillionaires, who are especially connected to the party leadership. And there has been vast developments that have taken place. But as I say, China is a country of almost 1.5 billion people, and you have to go beyond these coastal mega cities into the interior. And I have traveled in the interior, and I have seen chain gang people, working as chain gang slaves. I mean, it is not a rumor. This has been out there that China has, for instance, got concentration camp going for the Uyghur Turks in inner China. I have been to Urumqi, I've been to Kashgar, I've seen what has happened over there and is happening over there. It is frightening, and things have become worse, and the Chinese people cannot talk about these things. And in the interior, with that huge amount of population, the eating habits and cultural characteristics need to be talked about and discussed. This is not about being politically correct or blaming the Chinese people. It is about the problem. I'm here holding, and I'll just read a little passage over here. Here holding a report about China, and the author is listing a few items just to put things in context. He's writing, the coronavirus that broke out in China is a black swan event. Nobody saw this virus coming. Yet it shouldn't have been a surprise. China is the world's premier incubator of new infectious flu strains. Health experts blame China for the 1918-19 Spanish flu, 1957's Asian flu, the Hong Kong flu of 1968, the Russian flu of 1997, and the more recent SARS outbreak of 2003. So for an epidemiologist, for people who are concerned about these things, we have to know what is the eating habit, what is the food chain, what is the supply chain, you know. The first identified victim of coronavirus, it has been now identified, did not pick up this virus in the meat market, vegetable market of Wuhan, outside 12 mile or 20 kilometer outside of Wuhan. But Wuhan is also the only city in China that has stage 4 lab for virology, that has been, you know, cultivating all these various strains of viruses for various experimental purposes, including possibly biological and germ warfare. Now, the speculation is, how did this man come into contact with this virus? If the argument, nobody has not yet made that it is possibly that, you know, this virus the man came into this contact with this virus that was possibly purposely released or escaped, or in somehow it got out from this stage 4 lab in Wuhan. It wasn't picked up in the market where the virus went from animal to man. But it is also known that the Chinese eating habit includes all sorts of animals that we don't eat, including dogs and snakes and rabbits and anything that walks. Now, this is not
We eat
trying
rabbits.
okay, if you eat rabbit, but I'm talking about, I included it, but, you know, I mean, I don't think you eat dogs.
No, nor bats, nor some of the insects and other
Yeah.
creatures there. And I understand as well, Salim, that they fertilize their crops with human waste, which is certainly something that would not pass muster here in Canada, I can assure you.
So the thing is that the people, 1.5 billion people, have to survive. They have to eat. And their eating habits, their food cuisine is something vastly different from other cultures. And we have to know about this, and we have to talk about this, not as an insult to the Chinese people or the Chinese culture, but in terms of understanding where and how all of this has happened and is happening. But coming back to the more serious issue about this, more serious than the coronavirus in the sense of the consequences or the unintended consequences of this black swan event, is what it is now doing to the global economy.
It's creating a great buying atmosphere. That's what it's doing. I was looking at stocks today, looking for some good buys. But then again, that's one side of the equation. The other side is that over, I don't know, several trillions of dollars was lost on paper in this last week.
Precisely. I mean, there has been, over the last 48 or 72 hours, there have been the Dow Jones and the other markets have shown a huge drop, a big drop, you know. I mean, one of the factors about this politicization of the coronavirus is that this is also the election year in America. And the Democrats and their cohorts and the mainstream media, the corporate media and the academia and elsewhere would love to see that the first victim of coronavirus be Trump himself, that he goes down in this. They have tried everything to get him down with, with accusing him of Russia, the Russian collusion. That for almost 3 years they ran with it, and they brought impeachment upon him, and all of that. They fell dead. There was no Russia impeachment. Mueller found nothing in it. Then it became the Ukraine issue, and the Ukraine, and impeachment, and so on, and that turned out to be a big dud. There was nothing in it, but they are up and ready to run with just about anything.
And the economy, Salim, is usually one of those indicators in presidential elections that you won't find any president being defeated when there's a great booming economy for which he's attributed, and that is exactly what Trump is happening. And now all of a sudden, lo and behold, in an election year, coincidentally, we have this huge drop in the market from this coronavirus. I mean, I'm not one to necessarily talk about conspiracy theories, but I wouldn't put it past some of these people, as you were saying, suggesting perhaps that the level 4 virus research or biology lab in Wuhan, talking to Biden or some of those Democrats over there, say, hey, release a virus, let's create a world catastrophe, a black swan event that'll destroy the American economy so that a Democratic president can get in. Totally conspiratorial, mind you, but I wouldn't put it past him.
I won't touch that issue.
Okay.
But the fact there are on the Biden issue is that Biden and his son Hunter Biden, it is now known, it has been documented, were at the receiving end of Chinese largesse. They're picking up commission out of the trade relationship since Joe Biden was the point man of the Obama administration, both for Ukraine and for China. And Hunter Biden was put on the board of Burisma in Ukraine, and he was bought off by, people estimate, almost up to $1 billion by the Chinese. So yes, I mean, there's all sorts of angles over here. You have Michael Bloomberg, whose money was made in China, and you have President Trump. Over the last, this is his 4th year of his first term administration, right from the starting gate, had made China one of the key issues of his administration in turning around the trade agreements that were all basically one-sided trade agreement with China. America was running huge, massive, over $500 million annually trade deficits with China. And as President Trump has said, this was the largest ripoff in the past almost 3 decades of deindustrializing America, taking entire factories out of America to China. So, and he made that into an issue and started raising the tariffs, started, talking about moving America out of the supply chain with China, bringing back American factories back home into the mainland, and also encouraging the other Pacific region countries to start moving into taking over from the Chinese monopoly of becoming factors in the supply chain of modern economics. But getting back to the supply chain, I mean, the Chinese economy started imploding once the SARS crisis evolved. And the Chinese economy hasn't come down to its full operation. It is now over or almost a month since their Lunar Year holiday. And they're not up to speed. I mean, the figures that we are observing and watching and talking about is that the Chinese economy is performing somewhere in the 40-50% range, and it could be slowing down even further. And if the Chinese economy slows down, it affects, the domino effect is right across. Now, with President Trump having taken the actions that he took over the last 3 years, he, in some sense, ironically, insulated the American economy from the effects of the coronavirus. But nobody's going to give him credit for that.
Yes.
Bloomberg is not going to give him credit. The mainstream media is not going to give him credit. And of course, the Democrats are not going to give him credit, you know. In fact, it's the opposite, that he was hurting the world economy, and that's been the talk of the town. But look at it, you know. Walmart, Apple, you know, the garment trade, and all of that linked with it. All of these had parked their investment in China and bringing into the North American market. You know, we Canadians are as much affected. And the recent reports are, Wall Street Journal is reporting it, and I have all of them in my hand right here, that the container ships are leaving Chinese port with barely, some of them with barely 10% of the capacity filled. Now, what does that say to us? What it says to us is very rapidly, because these were not only on-time inventory supplies, and on the manufacturing time, again, on-time inventory delivery, that our inventory in North America is running down very fast. And we are going to get into bottleneck. And those of us, all of us, who have, over this past 20, 25 years, gotten hooked to the idea, going to Dollarama and picking up for $1 or $1.50 or $2, whatever it is, you know, from soap to toothpaste to medicine, 50% of generic drugs come out of China, and the other 50%, or rather 40%, 80% of generic drugs are manufactured in China and India. So medicine, we're going to be, we are already in some ways into bottleneck, and we're going to see that the shelves in Walmart and Dollarama across North America running low on goods, which will then have its own domino effect as people run scared and start hoarding. So instead of trying to be, you know, more rational and not panic and stop hoarding, when people start hoarding, that will again, I think people have already started hoarding, that will again have an immense, you know, domino effect on what is available and what is the inventory. That will lead to inflationary effect. And price of goods will start escalating. I mean, you can already see that. You know, if you go for your grocery, what a month ago, that is last Christmas, what you could buy for $10 now costs anywhere between $25 and $30. I see that every day in the bills that I'm paying, you know, and I'm, you know, all of us, we can look into this matter. So the Chinese economy, which had grown in the last 30 years from basically a third world economy to the center of the world economy that had basically come closer and closer, and the supply chain had developed, and Chinese economy had gone into becoming the world's second largest economy. If this, and it's not a question of if, it is happening, this start slowing down and imploding as we see happening, the downstream effect will affect all of us.
So there's a lesson, Salim, to be learned from this Black Swan event then, I guess, and we'll probably come out stronger for it, even though obviously some people are going to be dying because of it. But that would be that economically, politically, we should never rely on a single foreign nation for so much of our economy. We have to spread our economy out amongst other areas and nations if we are going to, you know, survive such another Black Swan effect. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. And it raises the whole issue of globalism in newer and newer dimension. I mean, what does it mean for a borderless world? We just talked about Europe. Europe is heavily dependent upon China. the whole issue, for instance, just take one industry that I would point out and the ripple effect of that industry, that is the auto industry, which is in some ways is the engine of a modern economy, especially an advanced economy like, you know, the European economy, German economy, or American economy, Japanese economy. Last year, according to Wall Street Journal, Daimler-Benz sold over 700,000 cars to the Chinese market. It was expected that they would at least, you know, this year double that sales figure. But it is not simply the issue of doubling that sales figure. Daimler-Benz is heavily dependent on the supply chain from China, that is the auto parts coming from China into Europe. And Daimler is one of the principal auto industry that has its auto part manufacturing, as is ours in Canada or in the United States, which Trump has been changing over the past 3 years. But in the case of Daimler, in China. Now, what does this say about Daimler-Benz for this fiscal year, for themselves and everybody else that is connected with Daimler-Benz manufacturing, you know, plastic manufacturers, leather manufacturers that will be supplying to Daimler-Benz. And if Daimler-Benz cannot manufacture the car because, or cannot manufacture in the sense of getting their parts coming in from China, and start laying off people because they have to, you know, cut back on production. So the ripple effect, as I'm saying, with just one industry, and then you magnify that, and you can see what is happening. Apple is already saying that their first quarter, second quarter business is going to be down, because Apple's manufacturing is all located in China, heavily located in China. Now here it is. Why did over the past quarter century did we in North America, in particular, the Americans and the Canadian, go almost full Monty with the Chinese, when we know that this country, that this system, this communist system is not reliable, is not open, that we do not have the information, and that it lives on the decision of a handful of people and ultimately the ultimate leader, whether it was Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, and now Xi Jinping, you know? So knowing all of that, our wise people, the leaders, the business oligarchs, they made the decision to go with China. They invested in China. They made the bets with China. And of course, they made the money with China. But now comes, in a sense, the price that we have to pay, the cost. It so happened that this is now the black swan event is the coronavirus, but it could have been any number of events. It could have been an event that could have escalated in a war in the region with the Chinese involved, you know, and in a nuclear power country. So, and the Chinese had their own ambition. But with this coronavirus and what the long-term and the short-term effect is going to be, I think that ambition has to be laid to rest. The Chinese ambition was and has been since Deng Xiaoping, that is after the Tiananmen massacre, that is from the 1980s, when Deng Xiaoping took over the Chinese government, his leadership, and turned around China into becoming a communist party, but engaged with a capitalist system of production, which led to this massive development in China, triggered by and supported by Western powers. The whole idea that we basically turned our backs upon is that the Chinese were doing this with their own ambition to become a world power by the year 2049, which would mark the 100th anniversary of their revolution. This is what, within China, this is the coded message of the Chinese leadership, that they are engaged in a 100-year marathon. The 100-year marathon is 1949-2049, and that China would and will become the #1 country. So it comes back to haunt me with that famous saying of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, that the capitalists will sell the rope to hang themselves with. If we calm down and look upon this, there are lessons to be drawn. One of the lessons is that we have to rethink those people who have been pushing the globalist agenda. They have to rethink it. And those of us who have been opposed to this, we have to make people understand it, that the answer is not a borderless world. You know, in a borderless world, nobody's accountable, nobody's responsible, and the people who are going to benefit out of this will be the people at the apex who will take the cream and walk away. It's the Michael Bloombergs and the Jeff Bezos and the George Soros of this world of ours, you know. So the people who are blaming Trump and holding Trump responsible, we should pause and turn back and look that actually, in some ways, once Trump is gone, people will recognize that he was prophetic. He was the guy who was turning the ship around and bringing us back to think about our nation state, our political system, our responsibility in decision, you know. And the bargain that we were making with China was a hell's bargain, you know. China has to go through its own evolution. China has to become an open society. China has to become a responsible and accountable political system to their own people. A country and a culture that treats its own people in the manner in which a totalitarian society treats their people cannot be trusted, period. And I think that's the lesson. The other lesson I think about is that a lot of this, as it has been politicized, is a lot of it is fake news, you know, because we don't have the full picture against which to make a judgment. So we shouldn't panic. We should not disarm ourselves from the seriousness of the issue. But at the same time, an open society, a free society can always quickly adjust, unlike a totalitarian society, adjust to find the remedy to the black swan events. So, I mean, yesterday night or this morning, we have the news that a free and open country like Israel has immediately adjusted to find a remedy for this black swan event. And we are getting the word also from America that they are rapidly testing vaccine to deal with this situation, and that we as humans, we will always have some new form of disease, some new virus that will strike us. But each of us are responsible. I mean, Robert, it simply befuddles our mind that on these issues, I walk into my university, I walk into the washroom in my university, and we are a G7 country. We're not China or India or some African third world country. And I walk in there and I see plastered on the wall instructions to our kids how to wash their hands, how to clean themselves before they walk out. Haven't they learned that? The simplest thing is personal hygiene.
Yeah, I think, Salim, another thing to take from this is that with enough of these black swan events, I think that we'll probably end up being able to predict them in the future. And of course, that's a bit of an irony, because the nature of a black swan is that it's not predictable. We have to leave it there, Salim, but thank you again for your insight.
I want to make the observation. If you can predict something, then it is no longer black swan.
Yes. Thank you,
That is
Salim.
the very feature of black swan.
Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.